Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our April PAM Town Hall Forum, Gathering and Sending, Perspectives on Disjointed Worship During a Pandemic. Our panelists today are the Reverend Kendra Buckwalter Smith, who is Director of the Worship Program at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and also Associate Pastor at Shadyside Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. Also, the Reverend Allie Utley. She is interim chaplain at the Graduate School of Theology at the University of the Redlands, home of San Francisco Theological Seminary. Our discussion today is moderated by Mark Kemp, Director of Music at Westminster Presbyterian Church, Greenville, South Carolina. Mark is also the president-elect of PAM. We encourage you to interact with our panel by typing your questions or your comments in the chat. And now, please welcome Kendra, Allie, and Mark.
Hello, friends. Andrew, thank you. And thanks to you and Kelly for all the work that you do in the PAM office to make these town halls possible for us. Today's conversation stems from Allie and Kendra's writing in the most recent call to worship that was published this spring, Worship in the Time of COVID. That's the Journal of PAM in cooperation with the Office of Theology Formation and Evangelism. We're really grateful for the work that office extends with us in cooperation, and the work that Kim Long does in putting that together as editor. And if it's not something that you read regularly, it's a wonderful place for these conversations to begin, wonderful writings that inspire us and challenge us as we hope to continue the conversation today from the writings that Allie and Kendra have done in this issue. So I encourage you to keep those close by. Mine are close by, right over there, actually. And I end up in those regularly along with the liturgical aids that are included in the copy that comes out in the fall. So before we take a deep dive into your writings, Allie and Kendra, it would be helpful for us all if you would take just a minute to tell us about your communities in which you worship and lead and plan worship, and tell us just a little bit about your roles there. Kendra, would you start that conversation for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I direct the worship program at Pittsburgh Seminary, which is a Presbyterian PCUSA seminary, but a very ecumenical community. And so we do a lot of work helping students to learn to delve more deeply into the traditions in which they've been formed and articulate those traditions, but then to put that understanding in conversation with the traditions and practices of other denominations and traditions. So we engage a really wide variety of traditions and styles in worship. At the seminary, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been worshiping online live via Zoom, and have continued with that through this year. Very similar to what we do in person, engaging different styles and traditions, but happening all on a screen, and have been it's been a really great educational opportunity to kind of sort out the logistics of that in that academic context. And then at the church, we've gone through kind of a progression. We're still worshiping until next Sunday entirely online. And we started out recording, like each pastor recording a portion of a kind of pared down liturgy in our homes, and then stitching those videos together, and then moved to recording in the sanctuary, but still individual videos and stitching them together. And then in January, finally moved to live streaming, which has been a really wonderful development and a great blessing to be in the chancel with other worship leaders and feeling the kind of coherence of the liturgy and the experience of the Holy Spirit moving, at least among those who are leading worship, in a way that we hope those who are participating in worship online are experiencing as well. So.
And at the seminary, you have 3 chapel services each week?
We do, yes. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, midday. Yeah.
And then at Shadyside, you have a Wednesday Vespers as well as Sunday Lord's Day worship.
Yes.
So that's a lot of worshiping going on, and
it's a lot.
lots of planning. But
yes.
great, thank you, Kendra. Allie, you have an interesting perspective both in your role as chaplain, but also, and as you write in your writings as congregant as well, that you bring to this. Tell us a little bit about how that all folds together for you.
Sure. So I lead worship at the seminary. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we meet on Zoom. And we've been doing a combination of midday prayer and guided meditations. Friday is our fuller service with preaching. And we've done, again, on Zoom, but those services are only 30 minutes long. So we've kind of rotated through different elements of worship. We did a series of healing prayer services where we focused on confession, preaching, and then intercessory prayer. We did sort of a frontier series where we're thinking more about music, preaching, and then affirmation of faith at the end. And then we've done a lot of morning prayer focusing on psalms and silence and singing. So it's been pretty varied. But when I wrote the article, I actually wasn't in charge of worship yet. So I really wrote the article for Call to Worship based on my perspective as a congregant, someone that is used to going to church every week. And obviously that was so disrupted by the pandemic. So that's the perspective that I took when I was writing. Yeah.
Yeah. And that perspective led you to some things that I think, and you acknowledge this, so many folks who are planning worship for communities are, we're struggling with how do we make these things happen? And you were able to back away from that with your perspective and see, I think what we all felt and knew, but how those things were, as you said, simulated and not quite the same. So carry us through that thought process.
Sure. Yeah. I didn't feel so institutionally attached when I was writing this. So I felt a lot of freedom to say what was really in my heart and on my mind at the time. I was thinking back. So I was invited to write this article in part because I put something really cynical and a little sharp on Facebook. At the beginning of the pandemic, I said, I hate this. I hate online worship. I really miss being in person. And then I think I said, like, maybe one day I'll write down some thoughts about why I dislike it so much. And of course, someone picked that up and was like, if you do that, you should send it to me. And then I ended up writing this article. But I was really trying to work out what it is that's so frustrating to me about online worship and what I thought maybe we could do differently, because I did have the ability to step back. I wasn't at that time planning worship every week. So I like found myself in this position of like really hating online worship and also feeling so guilty that I hated it because my friends who are pastors and planning worship are working their tails off to like make this happen. And so I felt really terrible about having the opinion I did. And also I knew that a lot of them were not particularly enjoying what they were doing at the time either. So I just wanted to play with it and think like, what opportunity do we have here? And how could we do this differently? Do we have to be producing worship like this every week? What are the alternatives? So I kind of wanted to just put some of those out there just in case it was helpful to someone down the line, should this, God forbid, ever happen again. So I was thinking, the things that are frustrating to me about online worship is I feel like I'm watching and I'm not participating in it. I miss group singing so much. I feel like that's such an important part of worship, like the affect, I just miss the feeling of being around other people. A lot of worship, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, seemed to me, especially as a millennial, was just having like bad production quality. Although the alternative of having like really good production is also weird to me for church services. So it's just kind of a strange thing. Worship to me feels really fragmented in these days. So in my article, I was thinking, well, how do we lean into that and think of, instead of trying to put together this whole service of word and sacrament, like what if we just take this fragmented thing and this is what it is, and let's not deny this reality and play into it. So that's why at the seminary where I work, we're doing these services where we just focus on 3 elements of the service. A 30-minute service, I think of it as being educational. We're learning about an affirmation of faith and different ways of doing it. We're learning about different kinds of prayer. So not trying to produce this full service, but just taking pieces of it and then rotating through what we're doing. And then the other thing is like, we're isolated right now. And so instead of denying that reality, like we're not gathering. So how do we lean into that? And that's why we're doing a lot of daily prayer and focusing on the offices and like this life of isolation, which, has some history in our Christian church. So trying to play with these different ideas and really lean into like, what can we do now and how do we do it well, so that when we can come together and be in person again, like we can have such a rich, more full experience, because we've spent this time in the pandemic, getting into small groups and studying the Bible and learning how to pray and learning how to like nurture our own faith and spirituality outside of this realm of corporate worship, which to me is just falling a bit short in these days of the pandemic.
I really appreciated the words you used concerning worship, and it's taking a 3D experience and making it flat. We're singing at the same time, but we're not sharing breath. We're confessing, but we're not confessing necessarily to one another. That was really well said, and I appreciate the fact that it's the corporate nature of those things that seems to not translate well across whatever media, screen, however else we plan to approach. But then you also highlighted in our conversation earlier that this has helped us identify what's essential to worship. What are the essential elements to worship that we need, and perhaps dividing out the other that's on top of it. And we'll jump into this a little bit further down the line, but I wondered how you've discovered what those, not how, I mean, we've all done that in worship education, but where you saw those things come to importance, and what you're, especially now as you're planning worship with your seminary community, how did those things come up, and how did you decide this is essential, this is not, and so this we can sort of take in a different way without losing some of the specific nature of it?
I think there's two different ways I think about what is essential in worship. And the first is like, what are, if you look at the Presbyterian book of worship, like what are the different components? We have the song, we have the prayer of confession, we have preaching, we have sacrament, you have all these individual things, and the central things are the word and sacrament. And then you have these other things around those. And those are the elements, the essentials that we've been playing with, right? And I don't know that I have answers as to like, how are people experiencing those things, right? I wondered about the affirmation of faith. Like, is this an essential part of our worship? And that turned out to be in our small groups, like that turned out to be a really fruitful, rich thing to have people say what they believe in the Zoom chat. So maybe that's more essential than I thought it was before. But another way I think to think about what is essential in worship is to think about the movement of worship, that we gather around the word and the table and we are sent out. And so when you think about those big pieces of what's essential, that's where I think that's where the disconnect is for me. Is like, I don't know if we're gathering right now. I don't know that we're being sent out. The word seems particularly adaptable to online, but sacraments less so. So in one way, you can think about the essential components and play with them the way, kids on a playground. But in another way, these essential components are missing to me in online worship.
Yeah. And we talked about the transcendence of it all. As you say, the word can translate into an online forum. Music can translate to an online forum, but it has to do so in such a different way. And without the space, suddenly we're viewing our worship, we're hearing our music in the same way that we, watch Monday Night Football on the same screen, where we, jump on Netflix and, have an evening of entertainment. So the transcendence of it and the different space is really something that I've found separates those things and doesn't necessarily pull us together. So, and then at the end of your article, you pulled those things out and you said, if we weren't spending this much time in production, if we weren't trying to recreate and then what would we have other time to do? And how could we support and nurture these smaller groups and the education elements and individualized fellowship? Well, that doesn't make sense, individualized fellowship, but how could we nurture fellowship on a smaller scale than what we're used to on Sunday mornings? And I think that's really essential to think about, what have we sacrificed in order to preserve what we know as worship and what we hold as valuable to our, what is central to our faith. the three of us struggled together a little bit about how to name this conversation, and we started with decentralized. But Kendra, you were so adamant that worship is still the central piece of what we do, and word and sacrament is still central to us, even though, so we steered away from decentralized, and we ended up with disjointed. So because it does feel disjointed, but still worship, word, and sacrament in some form, and however we've landed there, is still central to who we are and to our identity. So as those other pieces come away, that's still what we hold dear in our faith and in our identity together. So Kendra, would your article took us more through what we've learned about that, how we've learned that these things are not, all of these elements maybe aren't the way that we put them together, maybe the way we've assembled them. And we've learned a lot about who we are and our identity as we've carried through this year. And it's not necessarily a switch that we're going to flip off. We still have that knowledge and that wisdom. And well, I don't want to just read your article back out to you. So would you carry us into that conversation about where this brings us now and what goes ahead on?
Yeah. I mean, I love, Allie, the way that you talk about like I don't know, I think that this has been the opportunity of this time is to really think more deeply about who we are and what our practices are and how we're engaging them. And we have a choice, right? If we continue to try to be continue to be distracted by trying to recreate some semblance of our past experience of Lord's Day worship, then that can take away from the deeper engagement that we're being invited into right now. So I was writing that column shortly after or before maybe Thanksgiving, and we were preparing the Thanksgiving Eve service for the church, and I was just struck by the prayer that is very similar to the prayer we pray every Thanksgiving Eve, but kind of this dichotomy of we celebrate and give thanks, and yet we recognize that there are so many who can't celebrate, or we gather with our families, but there are those who are missing their families and can't be gathered, right? And so this kind of dichotomy, and then recognizing that in this time, I think we as a whole church have been invited into that other part of the sentence, right? That none of us were able to gather at that time. And recognizing the deep longing in that, the longing for community. And then recognizing that in fact, God is in God's self longing for community, to be gathering all of creation unto God's self. And so by virtue of being created in God's image, that longing is a part of us as well. We are longing for that eschatological hope. And I think in this kind of wilderness time, we're invited to re-engage that longing and acknowledge it all the more in a way that maybe draws us closer to God's heart. And so, yeah, I think from that perspective, just learning to take advantage of some of the formational and educational opportunities that like Allie named, these opportunities to engage in a different way, reflecting on practices in a way that invites people into deeper understanding of and fuller engagement with the practices, even while we're not experiencing the fullest engagement of them. So I mean, I think about communion. If we are engaging the sacrament of communion online, then we're probably inviting folks to gather their own communion elements. Generally, we all show up to the sanctuary on Sunday morning and the elements are already there and we don't really think about it. But when we're inviting folks to gather their own elements, then we should talk about why is it that it's okay to use the most appropriate elements that we have on hand? And yet, why is it that we traditionally use bread and fruit of the vine? That's maybe a conversation that we haven't engaged as fully as we could. And this is an opportunity to do so, to engage the conversation of, what does it actually mean to say in this meal that we are gathered with believers of every time and place? How are we experiencing that truth anew as we are separated from one another? Or Allie, you mentioned an affirmation of faith, right? When we engage the affirmation of faith, what does it mean to invite people to join our voices with the church throughout the ages in this confession of faith? It's a different experience when we're hearing the voices of those physically present with us. And Mark, like you said, sharing breath, we feel that, we experience it deeply. But I wonder if we can experience something anew of our unity and connection with the church throughout all time and places when we're in the midst, even in the midst of this isolation, when I'm only hearing my own singular voice making this affirmation and confession. So my hope is just that we wouldn't stop here, that we keep finding and creating opportunities for increased thoughtfulness about what we're doing and what God is doing in the midst of those practices, about what's actually happening here in the midst of gathered community, whether we are physically gathered or gathered in the spirit.
Let's talk a little bit about that very thing with the lens of hospitality, the things that we've learned, the challenges that come for those who weekly have to go through the decision making and the struggle, and we're all in that in between space right now with vaccinations, or I'm half vaccinated or I'm not vaccinated, and who can be around, and it's really a decision at this point. It's not as clear cut as it was early in the pandemic when we weren't offering any form of in-person worship. Kendra, I'm sure y'all have had this conversation as you move forward next week. My community has done the same. Who can come, who can't come, and how are those struggles? How do we still recognize those struggles, whether they're technological improvements that we've seen over the year, or simply accessibility within our, we've taken for granted that God is gathering us in this sanctuary, in this space. But I don't think we have that perspective anymore, that God only gathers a community in one physical space. So bringing that forward, the lessons that we learn as we cross, Kendra, as you said, as we cross that border crossing, we bring those with us instead of just leaving them behind and progressing past them. So talk a little bit about that for just a moment.
Allie, I don't want to cut you off. You said something really, I thought, really thoughtful the last time that we talked about just the notion that the greater, for some, opportunity or accessibility of online worship perhaps shouldn't be an argument in favor of online worship as if it's superior to the act of being gathered physically, but rather is almost more of an indictment on the lack of accessibility of worship prior to these online opportunities, right? And so the insufficiency of our buildings and our practices to be fully inclusive. And I think that's really true. I don't think that we should necessarily prefer online avenues of worship for all the reasons that you name. And I think that in many respects, worshiping online does and should make us long all the more to be gathered fully. What I appreciate about this time is that we as a church are asking questions about what like fully means in ways that maybe we hadn't previously. And so this shift that COVID necessitated has challenged us to think about inclusion of one group, namely those who are confronting technological barriers, while for so long many of us have ignored or at least fallen short maybe in finding adequate solutions for the physical barriers that others confront when it comes to in-person worship. And of course, there are so many other barriers as well, right? Like it's more than just building a ramp and installing an elevator, right? There are emotional barriers and barriers of language and culture, and then even acceptance. And I don't have any clear answers or solutions to that, but I just think that the pandemic has forced us to make a change in what we're doing, what had for so many of us become really comfortable. And we came up with these imperfect solutions as we did that, constantly realizing and trying to confront the imperfections. But maybe we shouldn't have been waiting for a global pandemic to force us to ask these questions, right? To force us to recognize the barriers and to seek ways to be more fully gathered. Maybe that's what we've been called to do all along.
Yeah, as you were talking, Mark, I was thinking about how this transition back into in-person worship in some ways feels way more difficult than any of the other decisions I've had to make along the lines of pandemic and worship. And someone just asked in the chat, is anyone considering a rededication of the worship space when we can gather in person, or reclaiming of the worship space? And I think about this is happening in a rollout almost. Like, it's not like, what's the day when it's safe for us to come together and have a celebration or rededication? Do we wait until everybody's who wants to be vaccinated, who has access to vaccines, can come, or do we do it now? And it's just, everything feels in some ways more uncertain to me right now than it ever has before as we think about reopening. But the difference between now and when we first started worshiping online is that we do have this space, and I think the perspective to be thoughtful. We're not just throwing things together anymore. It's like, this feels like a huge opportunity, like akin to the Reformation, right? As we go back to worship, like, this feels like a huge opportunity to think about what we do and why we're doing it, and to like gather our sessions and our congregations and think together with the church about what we've learned through the pandemic, and what we've liked about online worship, because I do think that there's a lot of things people enjoy about online worship. So let's ask, like, what are you enjoying about this? And let's really dig into that and see how we can replicate some of, like, I think there's some vulnerability happening in online worship that wasn't happening in person, and some accessibility that wasn't happening in person. So how can we carry these things? I'm just echoing here, I think, what Kendra has said, but how do we carry these things forward, and how do we go back into this in a really reflective, thoughtful manner?
Right. And when in the history of the world has the entire world stopped at a moment in time with the opportunity to grow and reflect out of that? Much less when has the church backed away from the rhythm of Sunday, that ever pounding whatever the worship schedule is. When have we been able to step back from that and think about what the ways that we approach it, how we approach it, and how we move on with it? So now is, like you said, Allie, now is a wonderful time to re-examine those, which is another question in our chat was from Lauren about how are we, Kendra, you said earlier, how are we taking advantage of this opportunity to be more thoughtful, not only in conversation with worship planners and worship leaders, but also are there ways that we can be more thoughtful about sharing that conversation with our congregation, inviting them to share their experience, but also the educational side of this is why and this is how, and is it meaningful in what we do? Have we approached it that way?
Yeah, and I think that the educational aspect has to be invitational, like you're saying, Allie and Mark, that we need, the goal is to get people to engage, that they can share their experience of these things, that we can hear from one another, each other's experience, and how we're engaging them. And yeah, I think inviting people into that conversation is so important, especially right now, when so much of our experience as worship leaders is like production, right? So recording something or speaking something into an empty sanctuary, and then it's on a screen and people view it. And we just hope and pray that the Spirit is doing something to get them to be able to engage and receive God's word in that moment. But there's so much, that's another barrier, a separation between kind of leader and congregation, that I think we need to be really especially intentional about inviting that conversation, inviting that feedback, and discovering how people are experiencing it. We know this is always the case in worship. We kind of know our own intentions as worship leaders. We know what we hope people will experience, but oftentimes the Holy Spirit does something entirely different, and we can learn from that and grow in that as worship leaders and also as a community.
Jeffrey asks about the role that online worship will play as we move ahead, and I think that's right on to what we're speaking. There's not only will people want to have, drive-through service and sit-down service and counter service and takeout all at the same time, and all these, because we've been spoiled with like all the possibilities now. But not only will people still strive for that, but it will also still be necessary, if we're honest about how God is gathering our community, to say that we're not only gathering in this specific spot, that God's vision and Kendra, as you said earlier, God's longing for community is different than what our eyes have shown us over the past. I also, back to that comment that you made earlier, and I think I gathered this from your reading, so I hope I'm not stealing from you when I say this, but we can also experience in a way the brokenness in our community and how God perceives that we're not able to, we can't embrace in the way that God wants us to physically in this time. We can't embrace that community, and we really get to experience the way God does when we're the ones who get between that community. I think those are your words, and I hope that I've represented them okay. But I don't know what role we're gonna take with online worship. I know that it's something that's there, and it allows a greater gathering, and I know that it's a necessary thing. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out and how communities embrace it or set it aside as something that we only need or only needed for a specific time. That's really going to be a challenge for us. Also, speaking of all the ways that we can do things now, we had a message from David Eicher. Yay, David Eicher, the editor of our Glory to God hymnal. So David, we're glad that you're with us today. But David mentions that he moved during the pandemic and hasn't been able to connect with the community of faith in his new location. But though he's still been able to worship with and be a part of the community from which he moved. So that's been a big blessing. But that brings to point that not only are our communities expanding, but we're also able to pick and choose. We're also able to grab this. There are more evangelists online now showing, hey, this was a great thing, or watch this service, or don't you want to come to our Easter sunrise service? All those possibilities now that we can share online and share with one another. I, especially early on, got to see all of my colleagues who I had no idea what their context actually was. I know them in conference settings, I've known them here and there, but I've never gotten able to see and experience worship as they lead it. But this a la carte, I'll be able to pick and choose, really is going to be a challenge for what our identity is as a community, and what is God, how is God calling us to be community together, and what's our identity in that, and what are the talents and things that we bring. And will people be able to participate, not Dave specifically, but will people be able to participate in that community without being fully engaged? And is that a service is that what God's calling us to provide as service for that community? Or is that, my tendency is, well, thanks for coming by and being a consumer rather than contributing to, but do we need to take a different lens toward what God calls us to do and how that feeds our greater community, even though we can't expect full participation. But Dave, thank you for that comment. Do you all have any thoughts about this a la carte we're going to pick and how that is going to influence our identity as smaller communities with them and greater community as God has called us?
I feel like there's a bit of a paradox, because I think in online worship, like I'm advocating for this a la carte, like don't try to do the whole thing, just pick elements of worship, right? And at the same time, in post-pandemic worship, when we can gather in person, like I do not want to advocate for that being the way that we gather Sunday after Sunday. So I feel like there's a lot of questions popping up and that I want to respond to that are kind of all linked. But one of the weirdest things about online worship to me is that it's so hard for guests to come. And like if new people can't come to the church for worship, like that's so problematic. Like what it's just such a bizarre part of like Zoom worship to me. And so I don't know what worship will look like in the future as far as online engagement, but I can tell you that I hope that we will not have online worship when it's safe to gather in person. I hate the idea of people attending worship across the country. I want worship to be in the community, right? I want it to be face to face. I want it to be embodied, and I just think that there's something different that happens when actual bodies are gathered that just can't be replicated online. And I have to say, I'm writing a dissertation about affect and emotion in worship, which is totally coloring my perspective here. But if I were leading a church right now, we would not continue with online worship, but we would continue with online small group gatherings that are so accessible to people. We would continue the Bible studies and the intercessory prayer and these small group gatherings. I think that we've really learned something about how we can gather across communities on Zoom. And I think that's great. But worship, I just think it is meant to be embodied in person. And I hope that's what we go back to.
So the challenge in that comes, Allie, with for those who go through the weekly challenge of then how do we physically, or can we physically get to the worship space, whatever it may be, or that Sunday morning challenge, the timing of it. How do we expand our definition of, or our availability of worship beyond, whatever your community's routine is? Because I don't think that I would embrace the feeling of limiting that worship experience to, the way that we had before. I want to see an expansion of worship in whatever ways. And I agree with you that the limitations of screen worship, so to speak, is that those limitations are harsh and create holes within what that worship environment would be. But I think the challenge is then how do we know, having experienced that separation, how do we know where to go with this, and how do we expand that possibility?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about just as a worship leader, and in the experience of, particularly at the church where we're live streaming from the sanctuary, and I'm looking out over a sanctuary full of empty pews, and oftentimes during that moment of worship, imagining and longing for the people that I have seen in those pews in the past, for the community that has gathered there, and yet that's not the whole of who Christ is seeking to gather. There are still more whom Christ is seeking to gather into community. And so I think that the liturgy, that's one of the blessings of the liturgy, is that it trains our imagination beyond present experience. So what if, I guess my hope is that I will continue to carry that imagination and that longing, even when the pews begin to fill up again with familiar faces, that recognition that we are not yet whole until Christ has gathered all of creation into Christ's presence, that longing has to keep bubbling up within us and driving us to continue expanding these opportunities. And so, yeah, I have a hard time. I'm not ready to say that I don't think that we should have online worship, because I think that it does still expand in some way this kind of experience of community, even if it's not the fullness of it. Where I have a hard time with it, especially, is, when we're thinking about membership, and like we just had officer nominations at the church, and thinking about, we had a guy who was nominated for deacon who has moved to Florida. And there was the question of, well, but he's still participating in worship, and can he still be a deacon from another state? Maybe, but at the end of the day, when, if I am a part of a worshiping community and then I find myself in the hospital, who comes to visit me from my worshiping community? Or as a pastor, how do I sit at the bedside of one who is passing into life eternal, and hold hands with that person's spouse, and walk them through that grief? Like, the embodiment, like Allie, you're pointing to, is so important from that pastoral perspective as well.
Yeah, I think the concern about growing expansive, like in my mind, it's just like that is equated with growing bigger. And I suppose I want the church to be more invested in growing deeper in our faith. And I think that the natural outcome of that might be that we grow more expansive and that we grow bigger. But for me, this idea that we should continue online worship because it is expanding our community, that just like, it kind of reeks of consumerism to me, right? I question the ways that people are participating. They're watching worship from at home, and yeah, our numbers are bigger, but what are we sacrificing in order to make this accessible online for people? And that's a really extreme view that I'm putting out there, and probably, if I really think about it, it's a more nuanced thing. But when I hear these talks about expansion, it just makes me think of consumerism and market capitalism.
Yeah, I fully agree with that thought, that that we put it out so that people can consume, that consumer thought that goes with it. Perhaps though, that's what I'm getting down to with the thought about what is this community's identity,
Mm-hmm.
and if that's the community, and if that's the embodied community, are we limited to just the people? Is God's work, is Christ's work around that only limited to the people who are a part of that community? Or can God work through that community into a greater community? For lack of another word, into a greater community? Can we truly know who we are and who God has called us to be as that community, and let it ripple out, let those ripples come from within? You're right, there's a nuance there. There's a strangeness there that we haven't had to struggle quite yet with, because we all took the before, well, I don't know that we all should, but I took the approach of we're going to offer this online, so we've kind of got the dad with the video camera on his shoulder approach to streaming worship. It was more of a bird's eye view. You can see what's going on, but over the year we've had to figure out, well, how can you participate in what's going on? How can you be a part of what's going on? And that's, I want to take this minute to say something about our First Call Pastor group has actually struggled with this and considered this together, Pam's First Call Pastor group. And soon I hope there'll be a document coming out with sort of their thoughts on, yes, these are the things that guide us, and now we have to consider these thoughts that go with it, and also hear the challenges and what we know and what our practices have been, even what our language has been. When we would say, welcome to worship for those of you here in the sanctuary, and also those of you watching online. That seemed like such a natural thing, but now we have to reconsider, because we don't want people to just watch online, like you're saying, Allie. We want people to be fully wherever you are worshiping from. And we also have to consider that and how we frame worship, because people are pushing a button on and off to begin and end worship. and then they're right back in the reality that they were before. So instead of entering into a space, and we get back into that conversation of movement, how does that embodiment of our entering into space for worship and exiting the space. So I want to take just a minute before we, good golly, y'all, you're right, we could talk about this for hours, but let's talk about sending just a bit, and how our bodily and how our embodied sending has changed in the past year with this experience, how we've experienced God sending us out, carried into the greater community, and what that means now that we may, or at some point will return to gathering and sending. Do you have any thoughts about sending right now? Allie, they were your words, so I'm gonna throw
Were they? I guess man, I think it's hard to be sent out from Zoom. There's a lot of grace, and I'm glad God works through all of the messes that we create. I do think God prefers to work through human flesh and bone bodies. But sending during the pandemic, it just occurs to me that I don't, like, we're surviving a pandemic. So it's really hard to think about being sent out and caring for others. There's some really clear mission things that can happen in a pandemic. But I feel really stumped. Like you said, these were my words in the conversation we had earlier about sending. But all I can think of right now is like, how can we be doing this when we're just surviving? I think there's so much trauma that the church is going through right now, and that individuals are going through it. It's going to take us a long time to process it and like come out the other side. So that's kind of where my brain is stuck when I think about sending. Maybe Kendra has some has more wisdom than I do.
It's such a hard question. I mean, that question about movement and worship and being called out in order to be sent back in, right? To have this encounter with our risen Lord in the community of the gathered body that we then carry with us as we are sent back out into the world. It's really hard to think about, and I think, like you said, Allie, we're just surviving right now. Like we're in the midst of this trauma. Like and that was a little bit what I was thinking about with the column, that we're in the midst of this wilderness, of this experience of longing and wondering, and just kind of like getting by day to day and figuring it out. And so my hope is just that those questions don't stop as we return to worship. Mark, you had asked something about like, are we looking to kind of an end game or a final goal or something? Like, well, when we get back into worship, and there's a lot of talk about returning to normal or finding a new normal or what have you. And I think that, of course, with all of these questions, with like the lack of experience of being gathered and sent, the lack of experience of breathing together, of physically being gathered by Christ, it makes us long all the more for the fullness of that experience. And so, when we're engaging worship online, where it causes us to long for that day when we can be back together in the sanctuary. And yet we almost talk about it as if that's our telos, as if that's our eschatological hope. And yet the reality is that even when we're back in the sanctuary, that's still the foretaste. I think sometimes in our worship, we might rest a little too comfortably in the foretaste, in the already, forgetting or ignoring the deep longing that we have for that which is not yet. And so that what we're pointing back to, what we're looking forward to now, was never the telos. It's always been just still a foretaste, and it's a foretaste certainly that is rich enough to nourish us and empower us and challenge and call us to seek that fullness all the more, to seek to live in the reality of God's kingdom all the more. But we need to hold on to that longing, because we haven't arrived at that eschatological promise yet.
Yeah. Kim Long talked about that in the closing address at Just Worship in 2019. She talked about our worship as a practice for that eschatological fulfillment. And it was, that has stuck with me in the days, I think it was 2019, but that has stuck with me. And I'm so glad you bring that back up, Kendra, because that is exactly where we are. So thank you for bringing that. Allie, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
Oh, I just was thinking of it. I have big feelings about worship just generally. And they sometimes change. When we were talking about sending in our first conversation, I was feeling so frustrated with the lack of gathering and sending. But when I think about it today, like our worship has been really insular during this pandemic, and maybe that's okay. This is what we needed. We needed our communities. We needed the support. God provided what we needed. And so this insular worship was right for the time. And also, like Kendra's saying, like, I long for the time when we have this fullness and that we can really be sent out into the world like a transformed people for the sake of the world.
Yeah. And Allie, you talk about the struggle that the church has gone in, and the mission opportunities and the things that, looking back, there's, in my mind, there's some disappointment to, boy, it's been a year, and think about all the things that we could have and should have done. And that's probably our drive towards having to accomplish things. And, had I, started to learn, Spanish a year ago, if I'd have known all the time that I'd be sitting and reading, then boy, I'd know Spanish by now, but I didn't do that. Or, this could have been a time where we reestablished this ministry of the church and that. And I think it's important that we embrace it. That's not who or how we need it to be. And perhaps that's not what God was calling us to do in this time. Maybe it has been a recentering, as you're saying. That's what our identity has been in this past year. Kendra, you and I talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, and that's our experience of the wilderness always, right? And every scriptural account of the people in the wilderness, it's about in the midst of uncertainty and doubt and fear and danger, recognizing that it's God who's providing for us, and that God is carrying us through that wilderness, but all the while is shaping us and transforming us, so that as we enter into the land of abundance once again, we carry those lessons with us. We remember that it is God who sustains us, who provides for us, and then we are ready to be sent back out into the world and to carry that truth to those that Christ is seeking to gather.
I feel like we should sing a song after that. That was a wonderful way to pull this all back together. All of these wonderful conversations that we have. I hope that this conversation inspires more conversations like it. I hope that this carries forward. And all of you, I hope that you find yourself soon or later around a table with folks to have these sorts of conversations, because that's what this community gathered is all about, to challenge one another, to see and hear other perspectives. And to drive us forward as we try to lead in these individual communities. It needs to happen more, and I know that it's on the horizon. Perhaps it's on the horizon at the PAM Worship and Music Conference coming up in June, which we hope you will register for soon. Registration's open. Andrew, you are like a rock star throwing that up right now, so thank you. There's the link at the bottom where you can register. I didn't mean for that to be a shameless plug, but we'll take it at any time. Thank you all for being here today. This is such an important conversation, and I hope we'll all continue with it. Allie and Kendra, thank you for contributing to the work of PAM. Thank you for being a part of this, and I'm grateful for you and the time that we've spent together. Andrew, we'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, and thank you all for such a wonderful discussion. And a special thank you to our panelists on behalf of PAM. You can watch the recording of this town hall on presbymusic.org/town-hall. And as we mentioned, we always will remind you about the 2021 Worship and Music Conferences at Montreat. Whether you join us in person or online, you're in for a fantastic experience. And if you've already registered, invite some friends to join you. For the Presbyterian Association of Musicians, I'm Andrew Perkins. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.